Hi, I'm Dr. Jo Marie Rios, recently retired professor of political science. And so I'm going to be continuing talking about different issues that are affecting our political system right now. And so this time we're going to be talking about democracy and autocracy. So I'm going to put some slides up so that we can kind of follow along here. Okay. All right, democracy and autocracy. You know, we live in probably like the best country in the world. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, we have the greatest democracy in the world. But you know, right now, our democracy is kind of like in peril. That's why they're calling it an existential, existential threat to democracy. Because they're saying, well, I mean, are we going to be able to continue the democracy that we have? Well, what exactly is a democracy? So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. Okay, so then on the other side, well, then what's the other option? Well, the other option is autocracy. So we'll be talking a little bit about that one too. Okay, so to talk about the how what a democracy is, we're going to be defining it, providing some characteristics, and then the types of political systems that we have, the values that kind of tend to unite us as a country, and then some of the rights that we have under a democracy, and that's basically the civil rights and the civil liberties. You know, back in the olden days, in 1776, or even before then, when the fathers were, our founding fathers were setting up our US Constitution, there were some things that they had to consider. Because remember why the Constitution was set up in the first place? You know, it was like to get away from the tyranny of the British Crown. We wanted to break away from England. Think back, remember the Boston Tea Party, the taxation without representation? And it was at that point that we said, you know, we don't want to have that type of government anymore. You know, we want to have our own government. We want to have a government by the people. So what exactly does that mean? So there's a couple of ways that they were going to look at it, and you know they tried different things like the Confederates, the Articles of Confederation, that didn't work out, and so they said we're going to go into we want to have like a federal system of government, and so that's called federalism, and that's a term that you're probably not familiar with, but basically that's saying we're going to have laws at different levels, and so the two levels that are outlined in the Constitution are the national level and the state level. So some things are handled at the national level, some things are handled at the state level. Well, lately, a lot of things are being sent back to the state level, which is why state government becomes more important. All right, what really defines a democracy? Oh, one is the vote, the right to vote, representative democracy, that we have the right to vote, we should vote. And the other one is the rule of law. And so basically this is saying, you know, we have different institutions that have rules. We are kind of a rule-bound country. Not completely, but we do have a lot of rules. We have a lot of legislation. We have a lot of code. They're codified. That's what they call them. Things are codified. Laws are passed. Things are codified. Okay, this is the rule of law, saying if you do this, you break the law. If you do this, you break the law. Okay, so most people do follow the laws. We have a lot of freedom as individuals, and these freedoms that are granted to us are granted to us through our our Bill of Rights at the U.S. level, and then we also have a Bill of Rights in the state of Texas. And I'll talk about those in just a little bit. So we have a lot of freedoms, but we also have responsibilities as citizens in order to ensure that we have, you know, an ongoing country, that our country is going to survive, that our institutions are going to survive, that our branches of government are going to survive. So we do have a lot of these types of freedoms, but with freedom comes responsibility. And, you know, when it comes to any type of governance system, what happens is this, you know, laws are passed and there's going to be people that benefit more so than other people, right? And so what happens then is that, well, people that don't benefit from it are likely to obey those laws that are set out by a particular piece of legislation, by policy, if the process is followed. That there's a process that goes along with passing laws. It's called the policy process. And as long as the process is being followed, yes, there's going to be winners and losers. Hopefully, it will not be the same losers all the time. But you say, okay, it didn't benefit me this time. Maybe the next go around, or maybe they'll change it when you know it'll be better for me. Okay, so the type of system that we set up is called a republic. It's a republic is a representative democracy, and what that means is that we vote in our elected officials, and so these elected officials or these politicians go up to the different legislative units, whether it be Congress at the U.S. level or the state legislature, as the Texas legislature here in Texas. And so they will represent their constituencies, or hopefully they will represent their constituencies. However, I'm not sure that that's happening at this particular point in time. And that's kind of what we're facing at right now when it comes to the political system. Is like, what are the politicians doing and how is that benefiting the country, or is it benefiting the country? Who are they representing? Are they representing themselves, or are they representing the people? That's a question that everybody has, not just me, everybody. But basically, the Constitution is the governing document that we have within the United States. Okay, I mentioned a little while ago that we have these values that we share, that we have shared in the past, and I'm not so sure that we continue to share them. I don't know. I have a lot of questions, let's put it that way. But these are common values that we have had in order to unite us. We are the United States of America, right? We are the United States. And, a lot of the times there's a lot of contention, there's a lot of conflict, but in the end, we come together. We try to rally. That's kind of what's missing right now. Some of the values that we have had is individualism, which is basically saying we don't want the government telling us a whole lot of things what to do. We don't want a lot of government interference in our lives. We value the democracy that we have, or we have, in the past, we have valued the democracy that we have. I'm not so sure that that's true of all the citizens anymore. We value the freedoms that we have. You're free to pretty much do anything you want as long as it's within the rule of law. You can pretty much do what you want. Don't incite the riot. This thing called equality. It's always been said that in the United States, you can pretty much be whatever you want to be if you study, if you go to school, you get educated, or if you work hard, or both. And you can have a good life. And they should call that the American dream. And the American dream was achieved through this thing called equality, that we have all of these pieces of legislation that will provide the opportunity for people to do better in life. And so those are still available, but there's been a backlash to a lot of those, a lot of the legislation that has dealt with equality. So let me talk a little bit about that. Okay, so we talked about our rights, and I'm going to talk about the rights in terms of civil liberties and civil rights. And so civil liberties comes from the U.S. Constitution. And as I said, we have the Bill of Rights at the state level, but the U.S. Bill of Rights, you should be very familiar with the First Amendment rights, which are your freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. And so basically that's saying, you can say whatever you want about the government, and you do not have to fear political persecution like you do in other countries. Freedom of religion, when this country was first established, there was going to be a separation of church and state. And so that one is even still being talked about. But that was established it's called the Establishment Clause. That's where it says. It says we will not have any one religion that's going to be dominant in the United States. That one is still there. But you can pretty much worship whomever you want. Freedom of the press, that's the media. The media has a role in that it plays a watchdog function over the political system, over the politicians, that they will report corruption, they will report mismanagement, they will report kind of funny dealings that are going on in our elected officials, the watchdog function. And freedom of assembly, that means if you want to assemble or protest, if you want to call it that, as long as you get a permit from the city, you have the right to be able to protest as well. And of course, everybody knows about their Second Amendment rights, which is the right to bear arms, and that deals with guns. And so, this being the state of Texas, and so I think that most people that live in the state of Texas do not particularly have problems with gun ownership, but responsible gun ownership. The problem that is being talked about now is about the assault rifles. And I will be doing a section on that one because that's one of the wedge issues that's being talked about right now at a later time. Okay, let's talk about the civil rights. I'm not sure that people are very aware of what's happened, of why we needed a civil rights legislation. And so prior in the 60s and in the 50s and the 40s, I mean, way back when, there was a lot of discrimination. And I'm sure you are very familiar with the plight of Black people, of slavery, of all of that went on, up to the point where the Blacks were not even considered a full person under the U.S. Constitution, the initial U.S. Constitution. It was like legislation and legislation and legislation and legislation to be able to say, yes, you are a full person. You should be treated as an equal, as a full person, but still not treated as equals. Okay, a lot of people do not know that in Texas, especially South Texas, that Hispanics had the same plight as Blacks did, especially if you were of Mexican heritage. You had exactly the same plight that the Blacks did in the northern and the other parts of the South. Okay, so the civil rights legislation was enacted in 1964 to bring equality to minorities and women. And so these are called protected groups, groups that tended to do not very well because of racism, when they call it systemic racism and systemic sexism, or institutional racism and sexism. And so these laws were passed in order to address that. Has it been fixed? You need to answer that for yourself, but it's still going on. All right, so we have these politicians and we elect them in, and we're saying, okay, well, then what can we do? What can we do? Because it is our country, we the people, right? There is this one concept, and it's called pluralism, and it's more at the national level than at the state level. Excuse me. And it deals with interest groups. And these interest groups are tried to affect or influence excuse me, the way policies are going to be shaped, how they're going to be passed, how they're going to be implemented. And so examples of this are like the NRA or the Sierra Club. And so the NRA, of course, does not want to have a whole lot of gun legislation, and they have been very successful in what they've done. So anyway, interest groups are one of the players in this long process called the policymaking process. But again, it's more dominant at the national level. So then you should be saying, okay, well, then what about the states? What can the states do? Okay, let's look at some other options then. There's some states that do have referendums. What that means that, if there's something going on and they're saying, we the people want to have a say, so let's put it on the ballot and we're going to vote for it. California has that. Or think about more recently, Kansas. When Kansas had this huge surge of women voters, regardless of race, regardless of party, regardless of income level, they came out and they voted against any kind of abortion laws in the state of Kansas, because the Dobbs decision, the one that turned back Roe, they sent it back to the states and they said, okay, states, you get to decide. Okay, well, that's how Kansas handled it. We don't have that. Texas elects its politicians, and they do have like their own system of how things are done, but the people are not really considered at all. It is what we call the legislative leadership and the legislation, and then the elected officials, the business groups, and and even the business groups are losing some influence. But people themselves don't have a lot to say. So that's why whoever we vote in is going to be important. Whoever we vote into office is important to have our views heard. Okay, let's talk about just plain Texas then. What's happening in the state of Texas when it comes to our governance structure? Okay, we have a Texas Constitution. Each state has to have a constitution because that's what makes them a state, right? So it's the governing document for the state. And so the governing document is the one that there's a lot of articles that says, okay, this is what's going to be available to people for the state. This is how the state's going to function. This is the rights that people have. So this is how we're going to be set up as a state, the governance structure. And so we have basically three branches of government, and that's the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Now, our executive branch is a little bit different than most other states, and I think only one other state has the same thing that we do, and it's called the plural executive. And that means there's lots of different people. There's probably maybe 7 or 8 different people that share the power of the executive office. The governor kind of heads that one, but it's the governor, it's the lieutenant governor, it's the attorney general of Texas, it's the railroad commissioners, it's the general land office, it's a comptroller of public health. I mean, a lot of people have a decision making over what's going to go on in the state of Texas at the executive branch, the plural executive. Okay, the legislative branch has 2 chambers. There's a Senate, and then there's the House of Representatives, just like it is at the U.S. level. And the court system is very fragmented, but we're not really going to get into that one right now. But anyway, so this Constitution was ratified in 1876. We've never been able to get another Constitution through, so this is what we have to work with. It's very cumbersome. It's very difficult to get laws passed. All right, so I told you autocracy was the alternative to a democracy. So what's available under autocracy? How is that defined? Okay, the best way I can say it's authoritarian government. It's also been called fascism. It's also been called a dictatorship. So let me give you some examples. Think of Putin. Think of from Russia. Think of Kim Jong-un from North Korea. Think of Xi Jinping from China. Okay, those are all dictators, major dictators. And so in their types of dictatorships, their people don't have a whole lot of say about what's going on. Check this out. The characteristics of an autocracy then are the ultimate power rests with the state. In China, it used to be that, and this changed very recently, that there could only be, a couple could only have one child. And if it was a male child, the government would pay for everything because it's a communist country. They would pay for everything. If you had a female child, you got no money. It's been only recently, and I would say probably within the last maybe 5 or so years, that they decided, okay, now people can have 2 children and the state will pay for it. Okay, well, the state cannot claim any kind of rights. People have no choices. You have to submit to the will of the government. So it's kind of like, oh, we have all of these rights. Up until now, we have had all of these rights. Do we really want those rights taken away? Because this would be the option. But, let me tell you something that I found out and this has just been within the last couple of days. Cuba is also a communist country, the island of Cuba. And so I just saw that their legislative assembly passed a law to legalize same-sex marriage, to legalize the fertilization process, that one, to process a lot of the types of different types of contraception. And so it seems to me that being a dictatorship at all, as it is evolving, and this country being a democracy is trending towards devolving or going backwards. So bottom line here, guys, go vote.